All right, guys, here's something that we really I don't think ever have discussed on the podcast. We've talked about jig heads, jig head color, jig head weight, and all that. But there's a lot more that goes into it, and including the shanks, the screw end lock, that's what I call it. I don't know what's officially called, versus the other. The actual weights, are you getting what you're paying for? When to use the weights, etc. And is there any environment, any circumstance when you do want to go short shank versus long shank versus a screw in, etc.? So we came to the right place, and that right place is
Anglers Anonymous.
How about that? Anglers Anonymous. We got our friend Mike Butler here. So, Mike, you and I were actually talking about this off air, and I said, those the Bite Me subscribers on the YouTube channel and on obviously the podcast might want to know some of these things. So, I have a particular jig head that I use, I trust, and it's this one right here.
Yeah.
That's the knotty hooker. But there are a lot of different kinds of jig heads, different environments, like I said, circumstances where you might use something like these hoagies that you have right here with the spring head.
Yeah.
Maybe this right here, the Beast. Where would you use that in? The screw lock, as I mentioned. You have some others that maybe would fit certain circumstances. First, let's talk about your personal preference and, what, like, people don't think jig head matters. It does.
It does. And a lot of it is, like everything else in fishing, a lot of it's confidence. But, the screw lock jig heads, basically you thread the lure onto it and you screw it into the screw lock jig head. The knotty hooker type, for the most part, they do make a screw lock, but this is the press-on type. Again, you thread it on, press it on. Now, these have real sharp edges right there. They hold the lure really well. Before this type came along, the screw locks held the lure on better because, as you know, once you rip that lure off the hook, it's hard you're having to change baits now.
Yeah.
But knotty hooker really advanced the technology there with the way, like I said, all their ridges have a very sharp edge on them. They hold the hook or the bait on there really well. Overall, as far as jig heads go, knotty hooker might be our top seller. We sell a lot of the knotty hooker.
Well, yeah, I'm buying some. That's for sure. And you know what? I never even really noticed that until you said it. But the bait stays on really good, and it's largely because of what we're talking about right here.
Yeah, it's got a really sharp edge. Once you push it on there, it keeps that bait from backing off there. It's the technology's really good. They put a lot of thought into it. Brian Detert is the guy that started this company, and he put some thought into it, and they did it right.
All right, so let's kind of work backwards here. I mentioned at the end the weedless.
Yep.
Now we know grass where I like to fish, where you like to fish down south. You're going to go weedless, especially starting this time of year.
Correct.
Any other circumstances and anything that you can share with our listeners with the weedless, the belly weight, anything like that?
Oh, we got a couple here, and these are just owners I pulled out. Trocar makes some really good ones. BKK, there's a lot of good hooks out there. For sake of this, we just grabbed some real quick. And what you do, they've got a screw on there, which you screw into the nose of the bait. And then generally the weedless baits, and I'm using this down south example, they got a belly slit in them. And you'll bring that up where the point of the hook rides right along the top, where you can work it through grass. If you've got a lot of floating grass, that can be a problem when you're fishing with basically anything except rig weedless or weedless spoon, something along that line. Yeah, very handy.
And let's mention this right here because we are at Anglers Anonymous, and you just snagged these jig heads right here out of some boxes you have in the back of the room. That's a good value, first of all.
We have a jig head bar in the back where you can pick out the number of jig heads you want. It saves you a little bit of money versus buying the prepackaged jig heads because you're not paying for the packaging. So, we've got a pretty good variety of those back there.
All right. Short shank versus long shank. A lot of times anglers will just grab whichever one they see next.
Right.
The right jig head weight, But what would be the difference for you with a short shank and a longer shank?
Well, what we see a lot these days, I mean, you can see this is a 2/0, 3/0, 4/0. And a lot depends on the size bait you're using. If you're using a longer bait like this down south, for example, a longer shank hook works, gets further back into the body. If you've got fish short striking a little bit, a longer shank is better because you're getting the hook back closer to where they're actually hitting the bait. The downside is, I wouldn't even call it a downside, it's just different, kind of different strokes for different folks. With a shorter shank on the hook, you're allowing the plastic to work more. You're not having that rigid, hook shank in there encumbering the action of the bait. A lot of the newer baits, the down south, for example, the big smooth, the coastal brew baits, the darts, A lot of
The
guys
ones
are
I
going with
use,
the
the knock and
Shortshank.
tail.
Yeah, the knock and tails.
You know,
another
you
one,
don't
so-
even really work it a whole lot. You're relying on the big tail and everything.
Yeah.
Maybe a short shank hook will get that action a little
Correct.
better.
Yeah, you get a little more wiggle out of the bait with a short shank hook. You've got more of the bait that's allowing the flexibility of the plastic to work for you.
All right, so let's talk about the weights here, because now this is something we have discussed on the podcast, but when you're getting customers from different areas of the Gulf Coast, really all over, what do you see in terms of tendencies, like where they fish and the jig head weight that they buy?
Typically, Galveston guys, further up the north coast, not a lot of grass. They're fishing in deeper water. They're going with a heavier jig head. If you're working the birds, for example, a lot of times you want a heavier jig head to get down quicker.
Yeah.
A lot of times the bigger fish are deeper.
Yeah.
You're getting a lot of the small schoolies up top, and you want something that's going to get down deeper. As you go further south, there's more grass. During the summertime, you get in a lot of floating grass. When the wind comes up, a lot of that grass comes to the surface.
Yeah.
So using a shallower or a lighter jig head, you're not wanting to run so deep, get that bait down in that grass and get fouled up.
Just out of curiosity, we have a lot of new fishermen that are joining us. You mentioned Naughty Hooker is one of your best-selling baits, and it's also one that I use. Again, unpaid endorsement there.
Yeah.
That's just what I like. It's a confidence. What else do you see people buying a lot of in terms of, like, they have confidence and it's a good sharp hook?
Yeah, I mean these come with the Gamakatsu hooks and the Hoagies and the Naughty Hookers also. The owner makes a great hook. Trokar. Again, there's a lot of good hooks out there. Most of the jig head manufacturers now are using good quality hooks that aren't going to straighten out on you, and they're incredibly sharp.
Right.
So,
well, that's really good stuff. Last thing before we get out of here, when you're using the screw lock, that's your personal preference.
Yes.
And why is that? Because sometimes, as we were discussing before we started this video, some of the scented baits might be a little better off with a screw lock.
Yeah, they hold better. The gulp are a good example. That when you put them on a screw lock jig head, I mean, you just almost need dynamite to get them off. They stay on there really well. Again, when Naughty Hooker came out, they they did a much better job of making this part of the jig head hold the lure better. Some of the old ones, they had the lead on the back end looked sort of like an arrowhead,
Yeah.
if you will. It had like a
And how many
arrow
times
point.
have you seen, well, I got to change my bait again?
Yeah, but that's pull off. That bait is useless unless you put a new bait on or cut that part of the bait off and re-rig it completely.
Yeah.
So,
Very good. All right, that is Mike Butler. We are at Anglers Anonymous, and of course, all these you can find here as well. Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast as well, and we'll hit you up again.